Good afternoon, and welcome to another very special Northshire Presents. Before things get started, please at any point type any questions or comments you might have in the Q&A box. Comments can go in the chat. And my name is Davith Wood. I'm the events manager at Northshire's Manchester, Vermont location, and I'm here as often with my good friend and colleague Rachel Person from Northshire's Saratoga Springs location. And so, as I said, please type your questions in the Q&A box if you have them, and I think that's everything. It's been a hard couple of years for independent bookstores and Northshire in particular. It's been a challenge, and we couldn't still exist without your support. So, a big note of thanks. Rachel, please take things away.
I'm really thrilled today that we're partnering with our good friends at the Iroquois Reading Council. They've been great event partners for us for a long time and do great work in helping teachers build literacy throughout the region. And to tell you a little bit more about them and their work, Shelley Fenton is going to join us. The Iroquois Reading Council is also certifying professional development credit for New York State teachers for this afternoon's presentation. And Shelley can tell you a little bit more. So Shelley, why don't you take it away?
All right, thank you so much, Rachel. We are so excited to be able to partner with Northshire Bookstore again and hear about some wonderful titles. Again, I am Shelley Fenton. I'm the Regional Director, Northeast Regional Director of the New York State Reading Association, and I'm also a co-president with Krista Senator of the Iroquois Reading Council. So we've had a wonderful year of programs. Everything, unfortunately, has been virtual as the way things are these days. We have two programs still coming up. We look at bringing in different events for the community and for educators. And in April, we have Geraldine Stellato coming in, and she will be doing a new twist on book clubs using podcasts. And then Logan Fisher in May will be talking about how to organize your reading life using your social media. So you can visit, or I will be putting that in the chat where you can find out more about those programs. And also you can always email us at iroquoisreadingcouncil@gmail.com. So I do have one. I want to get to letting all of the experts, but I do have one, and I apologize that it's going to look backwards to you. But this wonderful book that I just learned about this past week, it's called Legacy. It's Women Poets of the Harlem Renaissance, and it's by Nikki Grimes, and she's put a collection together of all these wonderful poets from that time period. And what she has done, there is one poem from that time, and then she lifted a line from that poem and then created her own poem using that line, and she takes each word and puts it at the end of each of those lines. It's amazing. She also has it also includes contemporary Black women artists to put in all of the illustrations, and in the back it gives you a biography of each of those. So it's just an amazing collection, and I would recommend it for middle school or high school. So we're so glad again that you are here. I'm going to turn it over to the booksellers, and we hope to see you at other Iroquois functions.
Thank you so much, Shelley. We were hoping that we would be able to be back with the Iroquois Reading Council in the store today, but alas, but hopefully next year, by next year, we'll be able to all be together in the store with the Iroquois Reading Council again. Also, they have sponsored a generous prize pack. We're going to be randomly selecting a bunch of you to have won one of the books being discussed today, and we will email winners tomorrow for that. So thank you so much to them for that. Our first bookseller who's going to present is Cassidy Washburn. She is the school order specialist for the Saratoga store, and she does a lot of great work with that and also reads a ton of young adult novels. So she is going to explain the school order process at Northshire and then talk about her book picks. So Cassidy, come on and join us.
Thank you, Rachel. Like Rachel said, I am Cassidy Washburn. I'm the school order specialist in the Northshire Saratoga location. Some of you may already know me from previous correspondence that we may already had with school order the school order process, but if not, I'm just going to briefly run through that process. It may seem like a lot of information, so feel free to reach out for me. I'll get my email soon here. First, I do want to mention that if there's a Vermont school or schools or teachers in watching this, it might be a slightly different process for the Vermont schools. So for that, you would want to reach out to the school order specialist in the Manchester location. Her name is Jeanette Sessions, and her email is jsessions@northshire.com. She's great, so she would love to help you with any questions that you may have. For the New York locations, basically schools or teachers, librarians will reach out to me looking for a quote on some books. It could be one book, it could be multiple books. Some schools have even asked for, 100 books for a quote. So basically whatever you're interested in. And you can do this in whatever way is easiest for you. Some schools will send me a Excel spreadsheet of the list of books that they're interested in. Some will send it just through the email or through a Google Doc. Basically, all I really need is the name of the book, the author, and the ISBN. That's the easiest way for me to look things up is through the ISBN. And of course, the quantity that you're looking for. And we do ask if you prefer hardcover or paperback so we can get the right one that you guys are looking for. So the Northshire Bookstore does offer a 20% discount to schools on a majority of titles. Basically, a lot of titles can be discounted. If for whatever reason a book can't be discounted, I will let you know right away, so you can decide if you want to keep it on the list or not. So once I get a quote for you, I will email it to you, and you would go to your school or your district and get a PO. And that PO, I believe New York requires the POs, but we just want the PO to have in our system so we can attach it to the order. So there's no question about where that's coming from, kind of thing. So that PO can be emailed to me directly, or you can snail mail it to the bookstore itself. But email tends to be faster and easier. And once I get that PO, I just will send the order away to get all the books in for you. Depending on the availability of some titles, the orders can take anywhere from a week to 2 weeks to come in. There are some that might take a little longer, like I said, they might be back ordered, kind of thing. If we find out that a book is no longer available, or it might be taking a while to come in, I will, the buyers will update me so I can then update you and we can decide where to go from there. If you want to remove it from the list, no problem at all to do that. And then once the books come in, I process it under the school's account, and you will get an invoice in the box or the bag that you will pick up from the store. I will also email the invoice to my contact on the order, whether it be the librarian or the teacher who's placing the order, anything like that. I will always have the invoice for you guys for the school to then send a check to the store to pay that. So if you, like I said, this is maybe a lot of information. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly. My email is Washburn@northshire.com. I might have missed something, but I think I got all the basics there for you. So you can reach out to me directly if you have any questions or are looking for a quote on some books. But before I head out, I wanted to mention a few books that I will recommend. My camera actually might be flipped for you guys too, so I apologize for that. But the first one I want to mention is Gallant. It looks like it is flipped, but it is Gallant by V.E. Schwab. V.E. Schwab writes a lot of middle grade YA, adult fantasy. This is her latest YA book, but honestly, it could be read by middle schoolers as well. It follows a young woman who is in an orphanage, and she finds out that she has family, and they want her to join them and become a family and be welcomed. And so she goes to the estate and she finds that there's some dark things happening. She sees what she thinks are like ghosts and like shades of people. And there's this weird wall that's right outside the estate, but it's like just something you can walk around, and there's a strange door in it. So she kind of is wondering what that is. And she finds out there's like another version of the house on the other side. So there's kind of like fun, creepy themes to it. I think it would be fun in the library type thing that a student can read. There are some wonderful illustrations in here throughout to kind of add to the story. Those are just black pages, but some great illustrations in here. It's a really quick read, and V.E. Schwab is a wonderful writer. So again, this is Gallant by V.E. Schwab. And then another one I'm going to briefly mention is Ain't Burned All the Bright by Jason Reynolds, and the illustrations and artwork is by Jason Griffin. This one blew me away, honestly. It is written entirely in verse, but also told through the artwork itself. And in this, it follows a Black family in 2020. So it deals with all the events of 2020, from the pandemic to the Black Lives Matter movement. Basically, any important theme from 2020 is in this book, told through verse or through the imagery. It's just so beautiful, breathtaking. There were times where just the image alone would just steal my breath away. I couldn't believe it. And I flew through it because there aren't very many words in it, but I think it's something that you could definitely use as a discussion piece in your classroom, potentially. Just gorgeous imagery in here. I love this one. It was definitely one of my favorite books that I read last year. And then the final one I want to talk about is a graphic novel called Squire. This one's by Sarah Alfagi. I can't pronounce her name entirely, and Nadia Shamas. And this is a Own Voices graphic novel. It's a YA graphic novel. This has some pretty great illustrations as well. This one follows a young girl who has always dreamt of becoming a knight for this empire that she currently lives in. However, she is part of a people who were recently colonized by that empire. And so she is dealing with becoming a knight and her loyalty to her empire, but then also her loyalty to her people and her heritage. So it has those deeper kind of themes, but is also a really cool graphic novel in general about a woman knight, a female knight. So it was really, really fun, fast-paced. There are funny topics, great illustrations, and I think this one could be really enjoyed by young men or young women. It just has some great themes, and it, like I said, is in Own Voices. So this is Squire again, and by Sarah Alfagi and Nadia Shamas. And that's the last one I have to talk about today.
Thank you so much, Cassidy. That was fantastic. And I hadn't known about Squire, so that's going on my list now. That sounds
It's so
really
good.
Cool. My list is dangerous. So next up is the wonderful Jordan Starks, who is one of our newer booksellers. He joined us since the pandemic started. And he actually floats between the adult floor and the kids floor and the YA section. He sort of reads across a really broad spectrum, which is fantastic, and specializes a lot in graphic novels. So I think he has some great ones to tell us about. So Jordan, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for Rachel. Like Rachel said, my name is Jordan, and I read a ton of comics. And so I'm here to talk to you about some of those today. First up, I have Goblin by Eric Grissom, and drawn by Will Perkins. I thought this was just so interesting. It's a fantasy graphic novel told in this very magical world, but our main character is a goblin. And rather than the usual fantasy tropes of this chosen hero going on an adventure, we follow from the perspective of the monster. And so Goblin, the main character, his name's Ricket. He is living in the woods with his mother and father. and they are just enjoying their life. His mother teaches him about all the kindness and all the beautiful things in the world and nature. And his father teaches him about what it means to be a goblin, which is to have patience and be cunning. And one day, he's called the man with the tattoos, destroys Ricketts' home and kills his parents. And so Rickett swears revenge. And so on this giant quest to repair his father's sword, he's given this prophecy by this beautifully illustrated forest guardian, and he travels across the land. He befriends a dog who he lovingly names Fish Breath, and it's just such a fantastic story of just overcoming the odds through cunning and patience, and through hope and optimism rather than brute forcing your way through things. The other great thing about this is just the artwork. The only way I can describe it is grimy, and not in a bad way. The art is incredible, and it fits this motif of the goblin main character. And it's such a great world to get lost in. And I really hope Eric Grissom will do some more in this world. And again, this was Goblin by Eric Grissom. Next up, I had Wind by James Tinian IV and drawn by Michael Dialness. I definitely butchered that last name. James Tinian writes a ton of more adult comics and a lot of superhero comics as well. So I was really excited to see him do a middle child comic as well. And this was just fantastic again. It is a fantasy world where magic has become outlawed. And in this world, the main character, Wind, has pointed ears, which is a telltale sign of magic, but not enough that he can really do anything with it. And probably this is just a story all about learning to love yourself. Because Wind is magic, he has been told his entire childhood that he is some kind of monster. And so he has these horrible nightmares that he's going to turn into the monster that everyone claims he's going to be. And it's just this incredible story where he works in a diner with his adopted mother and sister. And at night, he somewhat creepily stalks the neighbor or the royal king's gardener because Wind is a gay protagonist, and it is fantastic representation, but for a unique reason, because at no point is it ever brought up that Wind is a gay character. There's never a moment where he has to come out or that it is questioned. It just is accepted. And I thought this was a really unique take on the coming out and coming of age story, because instead of him coming to terms with his sexuality, he's instead just coming to terms with the fact he's magic. And so it's this beautifully illustrated just story of this group of characters trying to escape from this bandaged man who can smell magical creatures. And this was just so fun. The art is fantastic. I really like how they subverted the coming out story. The best tagline for this was, "You can't find your home until you find yourself." I really thought that just summed this up so well. I really recommend this one for anyone looking for a great LGBT representation. The colors were great. The world was fantastic. All the character designs were beautiful. It has action. It has jokes. It has everything you really look for. And the second book in the series is going to be coming out soon, I believe within a year or so, and I cannot wait to read that as well. The next up, sticking with my theme of magic fantasy, I have Hooky by Miriam Bonestra Tour. This was originally published as a webtoon, a monthly to weekly comic writing site where people can self-publish their own stuff. And in this case with Hooky, it was acquired and actually published in a proper print. And this was so fun. It is the story of two twins, Danny and Dorian, who are both witches. But in this world, witches, much like in Wind, are outlawed. Magic is very frowned upon. And so the best thing about this is it really scratches the itch for Harry Potter fans. If you have kids that blew through Harry Potter and now they have nothing to read, this is without a doubt the best thing I could think of. The whole story is about Danny and Dorian. They are witches, and so they are going to be sent off to magic school. But because of their own personal hijinks, they end up missing the bus and can't get to magic school. So thusly, the title Hooky makes sense. And so they end up meeting up with their aunt because they have to find a place to hide out for the next few months while their school's in session. And they try to have their aunt teach them. But while they're with their aunt, they realize not everything is as it seems with their aunt, and that she is currently working to overthrow the king. And it is just fantastic. The twins end up becoming outlaws to the entire kingdom. It's this wonderful, again, coming of age story. And my favorite thing I think about it is every character in it, because there's a fairly big cast. The cast is around 6 people, including the main characters, Danny and Dorian. And every character in it goes through their own personal arc and struggles. And it was all just very wonderfully done. I felt there was something I could relate to and relate to with each character that I don't always say I can with this style of with YA stuff. But this was just, it was fantastic. It is on the longer side, which again is very nice. And it is just this wonderful art style. One of my favorite things that they do with it is every character has a corresponding color to their dialogue boxes, which means this is a great intro comic for kids that don't really read a lot of graphic novels but want to get into them, because it's so easy to tell who is saying what, and it really helps set the style of voice for each character. If I had to describe this in one word, it would just be whimsical. Just from the way the characters are drawn to the humor to the wonderful world that they all live in, it is just whimsical. It is beautiful. It is fantastic. And it is Hooky by Miriam Bonestrateur. And definitely check this one out. And then as for the next couple I don't have the books with me in person. So I'm just going to share my screen quick to show you guys what those are. And so the first up on this is Better Place by Duane Murray and Sean Daly. This blew me out of the water. This is a story about Dylan, who you would recognize him more by the name Kid Cosmo, and his superhero grandfather, Red Rocket, in all the games they played together. Dylan has just moved to a new town. He doesn't really have any friends. His mom's too busy to ever spend time with him, but thankfully his grandfather is always there to play with him. But one day, Dylan's grandfather gets sick, or he ends up leaving Dylan to go to what Dylan is told is the better place. And Dylan not knowing what the better place is, sets off on a journey as Red Rocket to find the better place. And this was just such a fantastic, wonderful display of grief. This just really blew me out of the water with the way that grief and the devastation that comes with losing a loved one is handled. This is one of those graphic novels that when I read it, I wished that someone had shown me this when I was dealing with loss, because this just captures it perfectly. Dylan is heartbroken over the loss of his best friend, his grandfather, and no one will sit down and talk to him. And this epic journey he goes on throughout his neighborhood to try and find his grandfather is just so lovable. And it has this fantastic message with it of just because you lose someone doesn't mean they're really gone. And it was fantastic. This was just such a great middle reader comic. There is some foul language throughout it. Ultimately, it does serve a greater purpose, as Dylan has a swear jar to try and keep his grandfather in check. And so that becomes a running motif throughout, as one of the things he holds on to with his grandfather. This was just such a well done story. The art is incredible. There isn't really any color throughout, except for, as you can see, in those moments where he is imagining his grandfather as the superheroes. And it was beautiful. This was probably one of my favorite comics that I read last year, and I cannot recommend it enough. See, and then next up, taking a very different turn, is Dungeon Critters by Natalie Reese and Sarah Goder. I love Dungeons and Dragons. I always have it. I used to work at a community center before the bookstore, and I used to play Dungeons and Dragons with a lot of my kids. And it was so fun getting them to come out of their shells with it. And Dungeon Critters perfectly captured that magic that I had with them. Dungeon Critters is the story of a group of animals in an animal world who go on adventures together. And this was their biggest adventure they've ever gone on, to try and save the whole entire world from an evil plan. It was just so fun. The thing that I found myself laughing at the most was there was just very well done humor, and there was a lot of different types of it throughout. There was slapstick, there were jokes with repetition, and best part of all, the humor never took away from the story. There was never a point where I felt like the humor was being overdone and it took me out of what was happening. And then it also just it wasn't just a fantasy adventure. It was a spy thriller at one point, with them going on a heist to steal a map. There was a whole courtroom scene where they all had to argue over whether or not one of the main characters was innocent or guilty. And it was just a fantastic story about self-acceptance. Almost every character with the Dungeon Critters at some point struggles with if they're really good for the team. And that's mainly shown through June the dog and Rose the cat, with each of them worrying that they're not good enough for the rest of the team. And it was really nice to see how they're all accepted and loved by the rest of the team despite their mistakes. The other really cool thing this did was there was some really great LGBT representation throughout with the main cast. With one of the main characters, Trip the frog, is referred to as Prince Trip and is going to go on to become king someday. But despite all that, they still use she, her pronouns, which I thought was very interesting and well done. And then almost every other character on the main cast is either gay or bisexual, in a way that is, again, very subtly done and not forced in, which I really enjoyed the way they handled that. This was just, it's so fun. If you have fantasy readers who are looking for something new, or if you have animal lovers who just want a funny adventure, this was it. The colors were fantastic. The characters were all lovable and unique, and it really just stuck with me by the end of it. And then next up, if there's one thing I love more than anything, it is superheroes. And DC has been doing a lot of awesome YA graphic novels dealing with intros to superheroes. And this was Mr. Miracle, The Great Escape by Varian Johnson, whose name might sound familiar to some of you because he was also the writer for Twins, the middle child graphic novel. I thought this was so interesting. Mr. Miracle is a very obscure character. He was originally created by Jack Kirby back in the 1950s, I believe, and hasn't really seen a lot of time or like love since then. So when they made a middle child comic or a YA comic about him, I was so excited. This was really interesting. It's all about the story of Scott Free, who is trapped on this prison planet called Apocalypse. And he lives in this prison orphanage run by this villain named Granny Goodness, who, despite her name, is not as kind as she claims to be. Scott has been trying to escape Apocalypse for years, and he just has never been able to succeed. It was just so incredibly well done. I really enjoyed this. It's this fantastic prison break style story. The action is there. But with that as well, there's a very cute love story throughout it with this character you can see on the right. Her name is Big Barda. She is what's called a Fury, or essentially just a prison warden. And she was a very well done character. their dynamic between Scott Free being incredibly charismatic and just a troublemaker, and her being very stoic and serious all the time, was balanced very well. There's this really great love story throughout it of Big Barda not wanting to fall for Scott Free, but inevitably she does because he's just so charming. It was great. And this was really well done because there's a very nice balance between the action of Scott Free trying to plan his escape from Apocalypse and Barda falling in love with him despite all that. They're also a very cute couple because they have a very big height difference between the two of them. Scott Free is much shorter than Big Barda, and it's very great to see in comics a representation like that. But the main character was incredibly relatable because he's the classic lovable troublemaker who cares too much about others. And in this story, it's all about him learning that he doesn't have to take the burden of everything on himself. And that was just very well done. I haven't really read a lot of YA that has addressed a character just getting overwhelmed, and that was very nice to see in this. The only thing that threw me off with this that I did enjoy is Scott Free originally was a white character, and they have made him black for this. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a nice addition. I love diversity in comics. We don't know if DC is going to carry that on with because Mr. Miracle hasn't had a comic run since 2018. So that is the only thing I'm very hesitant with this comic. But as just an independent comic on its own, just as a nice prison break or a nice love story, this was fantastic. And then next up was Green Arrow Stranded. Green Arrow is probably my favorite superhero of all time. He is the character that got me into reading. And when I heard they were making a middle reader comic for him, I could not be more excited. This was just fantastic. It is a survival story all about sticking to who you are, despite what outside forces are telling about you. It's this Gary Paulson style survival story, and it was just beautiful. So this is the story of Oliver Queen, who is going on a business trip with his father and his father's business associate and his son, and they don't really get along that well. Oliver isn't like anyone else. He is very sympathetic. He cares about animals, and on a hunting trip, Oliver isn't able to shoot a deer with a bow and kill it. And the deer gets away, and then he's made fun of by his fellow friend on the trip. But when they end up essentially crashing the plane just a few days later, it's up to Oliver to have to save the day. His father is sick and can't move, and his friends are nowhere to be seen. And this was just so fantastic. It's this wonderfully done man versus himself story, but also a man versus nature story. I really thought there was just a lot to get out of this. Because obviously Oliver has to grow up very quickly in this story. And he has to come to terms with whether or not he's going to be able to do the things he was scared to do before in order to save the day. If you have kids that are looking to get more into superheroes, or if you want to try out new stories with them, this was just so fantastic. If you have a Gary Paulson fan, I thought this scratched the itch of it so well. And I really love what they did with him here. I'm excited to see if they continue with any of this story. But this was Green Arrow Stranded by Brendan Dean, or Deneen, I believe, and it was just wonderful. And then next up, probably my favorite DC YA comic they've done so far, Nubia Real One by L.L. McKinney and Robin Smith. This was just incredible. I think there's a lot of interesting discourse when it comes to comics and how much they relate to the modern day. And this, I think, was probably the best blending of being a standard YA graphic novel and an actual comic that I would go into the shop at once a month and buy an issue of it. The main moral of this story and the main idea behind it was, how do you be a hero when you're judged for the color of your skin? So for anyone who doesn't know, Nubia is originally a DC superhero who was Wonder Woman's sister. And she was actually DC's first African-American female superhero, originally written in 1973. And she's actually become a lot more popular nowadays, and it's so fantastic to see because I really love her. And this comic in this graphic novel did it perfectly of introducing her on her own for new young readers. There's these gorgeous warm colors that you can see used throughout it. All the character designs are really great and fun. There's also some really cool LGBT representation because Nubia has two moms. But the best part about this is it really balanced real world issues with all the BLM protests and the issues of police brutality, with also the superhero world in a way that made it accessible and understandable for kids who are curious but don't know where to start with it. In this story, Nubia has just moved to a new town again. She's been there for a year or two now. And one day she is at a convenience store when it ends up getting robbed. She has superpowers, but her parents tell her that she's not allowed to ever show anyone because it is not safe for her because she'll be treated like a criminal because of the fact that she is African American. But when this convenience store ends up getting robbed, Nubia can't just sit by and let innocent people get hurt. So she saves the day, but when the police show up, they accuse her of being an accomplice. And so there's this internal drama between her and her parents, of her parents accusing her of putting herself in danger when they specifically told her not to. She's so scared that she's going to have to move away again when she's just finally made all these new wonderful friends. And so she decides to go to a party to celebrate the summer before she gets grounded for acting out and helping at the convenience store. And so when she's there, they introduce a lot of this drama with this male character who is incredibly racist. He's a bully, and he works to try and make Nubia and her friend's life as miserable as possible. There also is a very big warning with this book, on top of the other issues of BLM and police brutality. There is also a school shooting in this as well. It is handled very gracefully and is very important to the plot, but it is something to be aware of going into it. And this was just a fantastic story about accepting who you are and standing up for those who need to be stood up for. It really balances the line between telling a superhero story and also telling an important story for the modern day, which I really enjoyed. It doesn't get pulled in either one way or another. I really think this is probably the best DC YA graphic novel that they have done. And I cannot recommend this one strongly enough. I really loved it. I just have a few more left. Next up, I had Odessa by Jonathan Hill. This was a really interesting one. It is about Vietnamese Americans set in this dystopian apocalyptic world where earthquakes have destroyed most of the world and have made it almost uninhabitable, with the exception of some survivors that are just barely getting by. And it's the story of Ginny and her two brothers who are living with their father now. They haven't seen their mother for years because she left for reasons they never were able to figure out. But when Ginny turns 18, her mom sets her a birthday gift in a letter and this photo. So Ginny decides that she is going to leave town to find her mom and find out what happened to her. And it is just this beautiful story of the bond that siblings have and the love that they share no matter what. I have 4 siblings myself, so this story really stuck home with me. I thought it was just fantastically done. The art is really nice. It has this very nice pink hue to everything, which was very interesting because when you think dystopian world where the world has ended, pink isn't really the color that comes to mind. I thought it really made this graphic novel stand out more than any others. And it was just really interesting. I thought it was very well done. I really recommend this one for any dystopian readers, for anyone who has siblings that they may not always get along with that well. This was just really interesting. And then just as my last one, I have The Magic Fish by Trong Le Nguyen. This was a punch to the heart, and I really loved it. This is the story of a Vietnamese immigrant and his mother who struggle to understand each other because Tien, the main character who you see on the left, he primarily speaks English. He primarily speaks English and not a great amount of Vietnamese, whereas his mother primarily speaks Vietnamese and not a lot of English. So the two have a very estranged relationship right now. But Tien is really struggling because he doesn't know the Vietnamese to tell his mother that he's gay. And it is just this wonderful, beautiful story about how do we tell the people that we love the things we need to talk about when the language isn't there. But the way the two come together in the middle is through fairy tales. Every night the two sit down and read fairy tales back to each other. And probably the greatest thing that this graphic novel does is the way they use color. So for example, as you can see, whenever they use this beautiful pink color, that's how you know that it is a story happening right now in the present. And this beautiful blue, purple, indigo is for anything that's happening in the fairy tales. And finally, this beautiful yellow is for anything happening in the past. And it's this really interesting story of being gay and trying to bond with family that you're already struggling with. Because the other thing I really enjoyed was Tien's mother is also a very important character because she has her own struggles, you know, with trying to give her son this great life while also struggling to provide money back to Vietnam to give her mother enough money to survive as well. It was this very beautiful story. They draw from a lot of inspiration between Cinderella stories and the original telling of the Little Mermaid story. This was just really fantastic. It was a really unique take on a coming out story as well, which I really liked. The color was fantastic. The art is wonderful. I really recommend this one just to any YA readers, for anyone looking for a very well done story of coming out, just anyone looking for a very good story. So that was the last of my graphic novels I had to recommend to you guys today. I hope you all really enjoyed them.
Thank you so much, Jordan. The light has changed now since I was on earlier in my house. I'm sorry about that. Really wonderful recommendations, Jordan. Really appreciate it. It's now my pleasure to introduce the penultimate recommender of books tonight, and that's Parker Goodrow. They're a children's bookseller in our Manchester, Vermont location and a talented playwright. Parker, tell us what you've got.
I just want to check really quick that my mic is working because I had to switch mics. Cool.
It's on, yes.
Awesome. So I've got a handful of novels and then a lovely stack of picture books to get through. The first up is Show Me a Sign by Anne Claire Lazat. I really adore this book. It is set in the 1800s in Martha's Vineyard. And it is about a real community there, though the story is fictionalized. When the colonists first arrived in Martha's Vineyard, there was a colonist who was born deaf. They didn't really understand how deafness was passed on at that time, but over the years, many of the people on the island were born deaf, and they created Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, which was sort of a codified sign language that existed before ALS really did. At that time, anyone who was using sign language was really just using it with their own family. But in this community, so many people were deaf or had deaf family members that almost everyone knew the sign language and almost everyone was able to communicate and participate fully in the community, whether they were deaf or not. So this novel follows Mary, who's a young girl who has recently lost her brother in an accident. She's put a lot of guilt on herself about her brother's death and feels that she's sort of created this untenable situation with her family. And on top of all of this, a scientist has arrived on the island to try and figure out why so many people there are deaf. And she is convinced that the scientist is up to no good, so she starts to follow behind him and try to figure out what he's doing, and gets herself into a little bit of trouble that way. One of the most interesting things about this is the author talks about it a lot in her author's note and the entries at the back, but sign language and English don't have the same grammatical structure, and people who primarily communicate through sign talk about the way they conceptualize their thoughts is not really in like full English sentences most of the time. And while this is generally written in, you know, lovely but normal prose, there are times where she sort of goes into that mindset and explores what it's like to think in sign language, which I thought was really interesting. And there's also some great back matter about sign language and about the historical community that the book is based on. So that one was one of my favorites from a couple of years ago. Once more, that is Show Me a Sign by Anne Claire Lazat. And then we've got Finding Langston by Lisa Klein Ransom. This is a really great book for reluctant readers. It's quite short. It is a historical novel set during the Great Migration. Langston is a young boy who moves to Chicago with his father from the South, and he's dealing with changes in his family, changes in the community that he's a part of. The other boys in the neighborhood think that he's really country, and they sort of tease him and bully him for it. And he finds solace by going to the local branch of the library, where it's based on a real branch of the Chicago Library, which was the first of its kind to really celebrate African-American contributions to literature. And the main character, Langston, finds out about Langston Hughes and about his connections with the South, and sort of discovers his own self-confidence through these authors. And it's a really lovely little book. And there are now 2 sequels about other characters in that same time period. So this is a great way to get into the Great Migration and the sort of historical relevance of the racism in this country that we're still dealing with today. Third, I've got Midsummer Mayhem by Rajani LaRocca. I really adore this book. It's a Shakespeare inspired, obviously taking off of Midsummer Night's Dream. And what I think is really neat about this is in Midsummer Night's Dream, there's a character that doesn't have a name, that doesn't have any lines. He is the changeling child of the Fairy Queen, and you learn a little bit about his mother, but not very much about him. But he's the sort of problem that is causing the fight between the fairy monarchs. And he is an Indian boy. And this story is about a mixed race family with an Indian American mother, and the main character, Nini, is sort of just feels like she's overshadowed by her very talented siblings, but the thing that she does the best is bake. So there is a baking competition in town from a new bakery, but there's something a little bit strange going on there. And she's trying to figure out what's wrong with the bakery, but she's also been distracted by a new friend that she's found in the woods. And when they start foraging for baking materials in the woods, strange things start to happen when people eat her sweets. So there's a great little twist of magic. There's great parallels to Midsummer Night's Dream, and a lovely exploration of this sort of forgotten character and sort of using his influence to bridge the perceived gap between, you know, actual great Indian American representation and Shakespeare, which you wouldn't normally think would go together. I think it's really fun. It's sort of got a lot for young bakers or young cooks to latch onto, and also people who just like a little bit of fairies and family mayhem. So that is Midsummer's Mayhem by Rajani LaRocca. And then I've got a big stack of picture books. I have one that's on my list, which I do not have a copy of, unfortunately, and that is I Am the Subway by Kim Hyo-yoon. I will just say that it is an absolutely gorgeous book. The illustrations are fantastic. It is a book in translation, and it just sort of follows the various people who use the subway throughout the day and what their lives are like. And I don't know, there's just something very magical about the way that it takes this very pedestrian thing and sort of uses it to show you a snapshot into different people's lives. I wish I had it to show you because the art is absolutely gorgeous, but I really highly recommend that one. And then I've got Calvin by J.R. and Vanessa Ford, illustrated by Kayla Heron. This is a great new book, just very simply introducing the idea of a main character who is trans, who is accepted by his family, who is accepted by his school, and just sort of in a narrative form outlines best practices for how to support a child who is realizing and communicating their gender identity. Nothing bad happens in this book. The coming out goes so well. The introduction back to school after his gender has changed goes so well. Everything is lovely. And that's something that we need for this particular topic. So I really think that this is a good introductory text for people who want to make sure that they know what to do for transgender children who can't communicate necessarily what they need, but can communicate who they are. So that is Calvin by J.R. and Vanessa Ford, who are parents of a transgender child. So it's based on their own experiences. And then we've got Outside Art by Madeline Cloper. This is a very adorable book, great for animal and art lovers. Pine Martin likes to watch the artist through her window and see what she's doing every day, but he doesn't really understand what art is. So all of the animals gather around to try and figure out what it is she's doing. They think that maybe she's making herself a map to tell her where she left her supplies of food for the winter. They think that maybe she's creating something to help attract a mate. The grouse is convinced that there is no meaning. And through all these different musings from each of their different animal perspectives, they hit on, without realizing it, a lot of the real reasons that people do create art and what art really is. And I thought it was just incredibly charming and a great introduction to some of the more abstract concepts of art beyond, here's a picture, isn't it pretty? I really think this one is a great introduction to sort of art and how you understand it. So that is Outside Art by Madeline Cloper. And then I've got Something Good by Marcy Campbell, illustrated by Karina Lukyan. This is a really beautiful book about a school in which something bad was written on one of the walls in graffiti. And the characters are sort of dealing with not knowing what it was that was on the walls, not knowing who put it there, and the stress that this situation creates causes people to act out a little bit, to not really know what to think about their own classmates. And eventually they decide that what they need to do is create something good in the space that the something bad has now been covered up. So they sort of join together to create this beautiful mural. And it's a great introduction to how to recover from an upsetting event that has happened in your community. So that is Something Good by Marcy Campbell and Karina Lukyan. And then we've got What Are You by Nyla Magruder. This is a lovely little book about what are you? She is a creature. She doesn't know where she comes from. She doesn't have anyone else like her in the entire world. And she's asking all the other animals for their stories, but she doesn't have one of her own. So she goes on a long journey to try and find where she comes from, but she just ends up back in the same place where she was before, and sort of discovers that she has created her own story, even if she doesn't know where she comes from. The art in this is really cool. There's some interesting ideas of like how animals would conceptualize their own origins. It's a great sort of adventure story, and also a story about identity and how you create it when you maybe don't have the same family history knowledge that other people may. So that one is What Are You by Nyla Magruder. We've got Love in the Library by Maggie Takuto Hall, illustrated by Yasmimura. This is a really lovely book, great illustrations, really interesting colors, and it is just a sweet, simple love story, but set in a Japanese incarceration camp during World War II. The main character sort of becomes the librarian of the camp to sort of comfort herself in the midst of all of the injustice that she is facing by her love of literature, and eventually falls in love with one of the other people who has been imprisoned in the camp. It is based on the story of the author's grandparents. It's just a very sweet, very beautifully done introduction to that period of history that doesn't shy away from anything, but also just highlights the endurance of the human spirit. And then we've got The Gold Leaf by Kirsten Hall, illustrated by Matthew Forsythe, who is a wonderful illustrator who's done some great books such as Poco and the Drum and Nina. This one is really cool because it actually includes the artistic technique of gold leaf creation for the gold leaf. So it has that sort of metallic shine to it. And all of the animals in the forest become obsessed with the gold leaf, so much so that they want it so much that they end up destroying it in their rush to get it. And it's a great introduction to the idea of, you know, who owns nature and how do we unintentionally destroy things by trying to possess them and not let other people have them. So that's The Gold Leaf by Kirsten Hall with Matthew Forsythe. And I've got two more. I'll try to get them through them really quickly. The Katha Chest by Radhya Chowdhury, illustrated by Lavanya Naidu. This one's really beautiful. It's a little girl going through a chest in her grandmother's house, where all of the quilts inside are made from recycled clothing that has been worn by various members of her family. And it includes these really lovely panels based on traditional art, where it just shows the clothing and the family history that is then recorded through the quilts. I thought it was just a great introduction to Indian culture, family history, how different cultures use and recycle their like various icons. And it's just a really lovely illustration as well. So that was The Katha Chest by Radhya Chowdhury. And my last one is Mr. Watson's Chickens by Jarrett Drapier and Andrea Surumi. Mr. Watson has hundreds and hundreds of chickens. He loves his chickens so much, but his husband does not love how many chickens there are because they're getting into everything and making it impossible to do anything in their house. So Mr. Watson finally decides that he has to get rid of the chickens. It's a really funny story full of lots of great sound play, and big spreads where you can just find the hundreds of chickens and everything that they're doing. I'm trying to find it. There's a great picture of like this, so many chickens everywhere. So this one's a really fun book, great casual queer representation with the main couple, and also some of the great you know, background characters of all different types. Yeah, that was a fun one for younger kids, especially just because you can look for all of the different chickens together. So that's Mr. Watson's Chickens by Jarrett Dapier and Andrea Sudowini. And that is all I've got.
Thank you so much, Parker. Last and not least is my dear friend and colleague, Rachel Person, who's going to take us away with a few things, a few recommendations, but quickly.
Yes, I know that we are over time. I'm sorry, we all get very enthusiastic when you get us talking about books. I'm no exception on that. So apologies for running over, and we understand if you need to cut out. I'm Rachel. I handle the events for Northshire Saratoga store, and Davith and I co-curate virtual events. We have a very robust schedule of school visits that we put together, of free author visits to area schools, in person in non-COVID times and virtual in regular times, in virtual currently. So if you have any interest in participating in any of those, we're always eager to work with new schools. You can reach me at events@northshire.com anytime, and I am really happy to work with you. So I'm happy to explain how that goes. And then I've got a short list of books. I'm going to do a screen share because I don't have them all at home with me. So I just put together a very quick thing. Here we are. Okay. So first up is two wonderful picture books. The Midnight Fair by Gideon Starer, illustrated by Maria Cara DiGiorgio, is an absolutely gorgeous wordless picture book. So great for working with kids on visual literacy, great for kids who aren't reading yet, who still want to read a book on their own. It is what happens when animals sneak into a carnival that has closed down for the night and take it over. And it is whimsical and lovely and charming and really delightful. And then the other picture book I wanted to recommend very quickly is Wishes by, I'm not sure how to pronounce, Nguyen Thi Van, I believe, based on their experience as a refugee from Vietnam as a child. And it's really, it's very simple. There are very few words on each spread. The art is stunning. And it's a great book to work, not just for talking about refugees, though it is fantastic for that, but it's also a great book for talking about perspective, because each page is basically a different person or animal, or in some cases, inanimate object, and what they wish for. And so it's a really great way to talk about different perspectives within a narrative with kids. It also has, it's super simple text, and then it has a fairly extensive author's note at the end, which covers the author's childhood experience of being a refugee from Vietnam. So it's great for a pretty wide range of ages. So that's Wishes, and then The Midnight Fair. Then I have a few easy readers and early chapter books. People probably are familiar with Matthew Cordell, the wonderful artist. He has a new series that he's just launched called Cornbread and Poppy. This is the first book in the series. There are more coming. And they are sort of a modern day answer to Frog and Toad. They are best friends, and they have very different personalities, and they have adventures that are silly and sweet. I would say it's actually also at a fairly comparable reading level to Frog and Toad. So really good for those new readers who are wanting to read a chapter book, but are pretty beginner as readers. A very, very beginning reader, which is more comparable in reading level to like an Elephant and Piggy, is Fox at Night, which is delightful. It has a similar to Elephant and Piggy, lots of repetition, very simple words, very few words per page. It's also about perspective. It's about all of these creatures who are afraid of monsters, and then find out that the things that they're learning about are not monsters. It's very sweet and very funny. So that is terrific. And then Dear Beast. This is the first book in a series. We actually just did a virtual school visit with the author and illustrator of this. These are epistolary novels. They are, I would say, at a sort of early second grade, late first grade reading level. Epistolary novels with letters between a cat and a dog who live in the two separate households of a boy whose parents are divorced, who have to share this boy. It's very funny. It's very sweet. The dog is a very bad speller, which many children can relate to. These are really delightful, delightful books. They're a lot of fun. So it is a 4-book series. They're all out now, and terrific, terrific books. So those are my early chapter books and easy readers. A few middle grade books. People may know Rex Ogle from his amazing memoir a few years ago, Free Lunch, about his childhood. And then there was a follow-up novel, follow-up memoir, Punching Bag, which just came out. This is his, I believe, fiction debut. It is a solidly middle grade book. It's a pretty straightforward middle grade novel in that it's, boy's parents have gotten divorced. He moved to a small town, but wait, maybe there are monsters there. And oh wait, now he has to save the town and save the animals. So it's a pretty classic middle grade setup. What sets it apart in a way that I really enjoyed and thought would be great actually as a teaching tool is that there's a lot of language play in it. There are a lot of passages where where Rex starts playing with lots of different types of monsters that are really obscure, that all start with the same letter or that all sound the same. There are a couple of characters, one of the friends, and then the narrator, who's a monster. There's a monster narrator, who use a lot of big words, a lot of very advanced vocabulary that they actually also explain because the other people don't understand it. There's a lot of very clever play with that monster narrator. So it's a very standard middle grade setup, which I think kids will relate to, but the language play and the sort of structural play with that narrator makes it an unusual book that I think is really a great teaching tool. So that's The Supernatural Society by Rex Ogle. And then again, you may be familiar with Matt Phelan. He writes amazing graphic novels, writes and draws amazing graphic novels, usually historical fiction. This one is more of a novel with illustration. So it's sort of akin to The Wild Robot in that it's a sort of early middle reader novel that is heavily illustrated. So The Sheep, the Rooster, and the Duck. It is set in France just before the French Revolution. It made me smile the entire time I was reading it. I was actually reading it in the store on my lunch break one day, and a coworker came in and said, "You have a grin from ear to ear." And I did, because this book is just so completely charming. The Sheep, the Rooster, and the Duck are based on real animals who went up in the first balloon ascension in France. And in this version of the story, they are actually also spies. The rooster is a swashbuckling rooster with a sword, and they have to save Ben Franklin from a horrible plot against him while he's in France. There are scenes with Marie Antoinette. There are scenes at the Petit Trianon. And it's really delightful, this blend of completely zany, off-the-wall fiction with real history. And again, there's actually a really nice author's note at the end that gives some good context of like, which of these things are real characters, which of these things are completely made up. Obviously, there's not a chicken fencing, that's not happening. But it does talk about who the real characters are and what the real history is. And so I thought that was a really delightful blend and a great opportunity to talk about fact and fiction. And then the last of my middle grade suggestions is Big Apple Diaries by Elisa Bermudez, who is also someone we hosted for a virtual visit this past fall. This is graphic nonfiction or graphic memoir. So it's, looks and feels exactly like a graphic novel, great for Raina Telgemeier fans, those sorts of readers. And it is her basically written as taking her own diaries of being a middle schooler in New York City from 2000 through 2001. So it covers normal, I have a crush, I like this boy, does he like me? Oh, I'm fighting with my friend, I'm not sure I like my eyebrows, and also being a middle schooler in New York City on 9/11. So it combines the very serious with the very everyday in a really lovely way, and is a really beautiful, great book. So that is Big Apple Diaries by Alyssa Bermudez. And then I just have two very quick books to point out. Just I've been getting questions in the store and from parents that I know of, like, do you have any books set in Russia? Do you have any books set in Ukraine? There aren't a ton, but Anne Blankman, The Blackbird Girls, is a really lovely historical fiction novel set in Ukraine at the time of the Chernobyl disaster that deals with, among other things, obviously Chernobyl, but also the anti-Semitism experienced by some Jews in Ukraine at that time. It's extremely well done. My son loved it. We actually used this one in our summer camp a few years ago, and all of the kids really loved it. And Anne Blankman is actually originally from this area. She doesn't live around here now, but she grew up and I think went to Niskayuna school, so from this area. And Eugene Yelchin, The Genius Under the Table. This is his memoir of growing up behind the Iron Curtain in Soviet Russia. So he's a sort of legendary picture book illustrator, and this book is really cool. It is also heavily illustrated and very well done. And I actually forgot to put a slide together. I'm sorry, for my couple of nonfiction books. So I'm going to stop screen share. If I can find that, there we are. And one of them was Maxwell Eaton's book about maple sugaring, which is delightful. Maxwell Eaton is based in the Adirondacks, so he is another author who may be an option for school visits. It's called Bear Goes Sugaring. It is comic book format, really accurate, good information on how maple syrup is made. So that is good nonfiction for that. And then a young reader's adaptation of an adult book, which I don't normally go in for, but this is Prisoners of Geography, A World Explained in 12 Simple Maps, Illustrated Young Readers Edition by Tim Marshall, is a really, really well done. Takes 12 different regions of the world, talks about their history, shows maps, and explains about how the two have impacted each other, how geography has created history. Again, I was looking through it, a thing that is relevant to current events, which I had never known. Russia has long wanted to have Crimea, which is part of Ukraine, because without it, they have no access to a year-round port. The only ports in Russia, harbors in Russia proper, freeze over in the winter. So a thing that I had never known that I saw in this book that's completely relevant. So there's a lot of really interesting history like that in Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall. That is my last book. Apologies for going so long, everyone. Thank you for staying with us so long. It has been great to speak with you today about all of these great books. You can find them all in the blog post that David posted at northshire.com that you've been following along with. And you can reach us anytime with questions at events@northshire.com. We're happy to help out, and have a great rest of your day. And I will be emailing winners of the prize drawing tomorrow. So thank you so much. Take care, everybody.